Hey everybody. So we don't have a especially long Upjet SIG meeting agenda today. So um, we recently had a question in Slack in the Crossplane community workspace around the changes we made to the official providers earlier this year, and that came with Upjet V1, where we bypassed the Terraform CLI for the reconciliation of resources. As a reminder, we blogged about this in kind of like March of this year, and we talked about in the old architecture, essentially the object-based provider would have an object runtime, which make calls to which the crossplane, which receive the crossplane reconciler's request. It would make calls to Terraform CLI, which would in turn fork processes of the Terraform provider, which would then make calls to the external API. In the new architecture, we basically combine the runtime in the provider by directly speaking to it and cutting out the middleman in the Terraform CLI. And that resulted in massive improvements in CPU and memory utilization, and so forth. Now, I will say that for probably a big part of the crossplane object-based providers out there, using the Terraform CLI approach is totally feasible. Specifically for the official providers, for AWS, GCP, and Azure, because of the scale and the number of resources and the usage around it, it was causing quite a bit of issues for folks, and we needed to improve that. And this is the approach we're in now. Move on a couple of months, like you might ask, why is our the Upjet, if you go to, there's a Upjet template now, but you might ask, why does that Upjet template, provider template, still use the old way? And the one of the reasons is that it's simply not as easy to configure a provider to use the new architecture, and there isn't necessarily a generic approach that could potentially work for all situations out there. And so we've been hesitant to update it to use that, especially when the community might run into more challenges that needs to be sorted out. Anyway, all of that said, since we have a little bit of time in the SIG meeting today, and it was a topic that came up recently, and we have Jim here who was involved in helping roll out this change to Upbound's official providers. I wanted us to do a quick show and tell, and maybe just talk around the high level concepts of what one might need to look at and do to be able to use the new architecture. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Jem to take us through how you might approach this if you wanted to do it for a new provider today. Over to you, Jem.
Thank you, John. Let me share my screen and walk you through some of the ideas I have in mind without much preparation beforehand. So the question arose from this Upjet provider template repo here, Upjet provider template. And we can see here in its Docker file, we have all the things that enables Terraform CLI reconciliation. And the reason is Upjet is something generic. Indeed, we don't really want to remove Terraform CLI work from Upjet because people are using it. Even new providers can be built with Terraform CLI. People might want to do that. Indeed, it is the easiest way to implement a new provider because there might be some concerns regarding not using Terraform CLI. It is more complicated, and if you have experience, you can migrate from Terraform CLI based reconciliation to what we call forkless, no fork architecture. We call that different things. It would be easier then. So that's why we haven't removed Terraform CLI reconciliation here. What we could have done is make it configurable so that if we are using Terraform CLI, everything, including this Docker file, is built accordingly. But like you said, John, it's difficult. It's a lot of work, And in many places, they are tightly coupled that separating them wasn't going to be feasible. We hope that in the meantime, we are going to streamline the way forkless architecture is. We want to make it more accessible so that people begin with that right away. Until then, we have the option to use Terraform CLI in reconciliation. So that's why we have this Terraform CLI stuff in the Docker file. Let's switch to the provider AWS Docker file. So this is provider Upjet AWS Docker file. As you can see, there is nothing here regarding Terraform CLI work. Even though we switched to forkless architecture around November last year, almost a year from now, we removed Terraform CLI work later. As you can see, let's check the diff here. As you can see, we have removed lots of stuff from here. For instance, all these commands to install the Terraform CLI and use it are now removed. Also, I would like to talk about, let me see what we have here. We have Upjet generating a crossplane provider. All right. Now that this is acting as a documentation for future use, if you are new to Upjet and would like to generate your own provider using Upjet, you can find the docs here. Just visit Upjet docs and generating a provider here. We have a guide that explains both, I believe, Terraform CLI reconciliation and forkless one, though I'm not sure, so please don't quote me on that, but maybe check in with us over the community Slack to how you can implement the things in the forkless way. So let's also talk about that one. We are going to visit a very important file. So this is my work in progress right now. We are going to visit one of the most important files in our providers, which is external name.go in config directory. So here you will see that there are hundreds of resources defined. So this is only the, of course, configuration of the external names of the resources. Configuration of the resources are done in different files. But what you will see here is we have 3 top-level maps. The first one is, for instance, Terraform plugin framework external name config. These are the resources which are implemented using Terraform plugin framework. So we didn't have any distinction between Terraform plugin framework resources and Terraform plugin SDK v2 resources in Terraform CLI. But here, now we have to distinguish between them. So this is
Do you mind quickly giving folks just like a 101 on the difference between the SDK and the plugin framework?
Yeah, sure. I can do it in one sentence. Terraform plugin SDK v2 is the old way. Terraform plugin framework is the new way. So there are lots of improvements done to the plugin framework architecture. Terraform people got their lessons learned from implementing SDK v2 and implemented many nice features that benefit using these resources a great deal. Basically, in one of the most important differences that we observed, at least regarding our work, was in SDK v2, it didn't have a notion of whether, let me see, whether a field changed or not. It wasn't as clear, for instance. There was the diffs contained old and new values, but I mean, whether there is really a diff or not was a matter of difficulty. So in plugin framework arc, another one, whether a value is defined or if it's empty wasn't distinguished in SDK v2, but now in plugin framework values can be distinguished to be empty or undefined and whatnot. It's nice in that regard. So yeah, the new way is plugin framework. I mean, the official policy in Terraform AWS, for instance, is to implement a new resource in plugin framework. It's the way forward. But because we have a lot of resources in SDK v2, I mean, until they are migrated all, we will have to deal with it. So we are also dealing with the distinction here. We have another high-level map here, Terraform plugin SDK external name configs. So all our resources which are reconciled using plugin SDK v2 are listed here. So we have a third one. Let's see if we have it defined here. Or maybe we might have removed it altogether, of course. But we should be able to see it at the end. And as you might guess, the last one is the resources that are reconciled with Terraform CLI. Scroll. Yep. Yes, we have it here, but it is defined as empty. Indeed, we still have the option, we keep the option to reconcile resources using CLI in the code, though in practice, as you know, we don't have the necessary binaries in the Docker file, etc. And for instance, down here, I will scroll. There should be a method that we use to determine which configuration to use. Let me see. All right, we have this resource configurator here. So we have these three sets of resources: CLI, plugin framework, plugin SDK v2. In this resource configurator, we are deciding which one to use. So the first one we check is if it's a plugin framework resource, we use it from the plugin framework. If not, we are going to check if it's an SDK resource here. If not, we are going to check if it's a CLI resource here. So we are going to use them accordingly. When people are defining their own providers, they can use the structure defined here. And yeah, it's always a good idea to check our official, object-based providers, the structure around here, and try to implement, try to structure your provider similar to what we have done here. But when you observe these, even these have differences between them. I mean, provider Upjet AWS is different than GCP, and it's different than Azure. So don't consider these as the best way to implement things, because all these providers, all these cloud providers have their peculiarities around which we have to navigate. But you can take this as a guideline. I mean, the whole repo. One last thing that I would like to mention is the clients. So the biggest obstacle in front of everyone easily switching to no-fork architecture is the difficulty in having access to the SDK clients that even Terraform providers use. In provider Upjet AWS, let's go to aws.go. And this is where we configure our own AWS SDK client, and in our own way to suit our own needs. And it is also used by the Terraform provider, and it is partially configured by us. So if you would like to use no-fork architecture, you have to be integrating deeper parts of the Terraform provider to understand how they use their SDK client, and if you should configure that client yourself. For instance, let's we have this method here, for instance, configure no-fork AWS client. You can see we have our own AWS config here. We set our own parameters here. We do some additional stuff. For instance, there was this call counter I worked on. We use this middleware functionality that AWS SDK offers to count API calls, external API calls. So we register it here. And yeah, there are quite important details that make things work in the no-fork architecture here. So that's another challenge implementing a no-fork provider. I guess that's all, John. I tried to cover everything that I can immediately think about implementing a provider, Terraform CLI versus no-fork architecture. Do you have any questions?
So, I think, like this kind of like gives a good summary and also an understanding of why it's not just as simple as updating our Upjet provider template to use this new way. Hopefully at some point down the line we can get to that to make it easier for folks. But for now, if you do want to go down this road, reach out in the Upjet SIG channel in Crossplane Workspace, join the SIG meeting. We're happy to discuss and collaborate with folks on that to help them if they feel like the approach to eliminate the Terraform CLI from their reconciliation path is beneficial for their plugin. Cool. All right. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, John.
All right. With there not being any other agenda items, let's call it a day. Thank you, folks, for joining, and have a good rest of your day.
Goodbye.